new achievements, ourselves for always and never any others? Could the answer be in doubt? We shall not fear the summons of death. We shall remember those who have gone before us and those who will come after us. Alas for those who cannot sing, but die with their music in them. Let us treasure the time that we have and resolve to use it well, counting each moment as precious, a chance to apprehend some truth, to experience some beauty, to conquer some evil, to relieve some suffering, to love and to be loved, and to achieve something of lasting worth, as Mary Frances did. Help us then, O God, to fulfill the promise that is in each of us, and so to conduct ourselves that generations hence it will be true of us to say, the world is better because for a brief space of time we lived in it. A tribute to Mary Frances Bester.
Good afternoon. I want to thank all of the members of Mary Frances's extended family for the honor of being part of this celebration of her really remarkable life. It is a huge pleasure for me to be here. Jane and I came to Chautauqua in 1985, and part of that first summer on the grounds we stayed en route in the home that Mary Frances grew up in, and she would tell us stories. You may know that Mary Frances is a storyteller. In fact, if you're related to her, you are by a DNA transfer a storyteller. Not all of them are true, nor do they need to be. Well, put differently, not all of them are factual, but they're all true. At least true to her sense of what was right. She told great stories about that house, about the amazing people who went through there. You think about how these young people grew up, both in terms of the parents that they had, but the circumstances and the relationships, the mayonnaise making with Eleanor Roosevelt, etc. So when I came here, I know this is stunning to some of you who have been around Chautauqua for a long time, but a lot of what Dan Rutten was dealing with was a suspicion of leadership. You know, go figure. And part of that was that there was going to be change at Chautauqua. And I scratched my head over that and tried to figure out what to do about it. And that's when we thought about the Bester Society and the Bester years, precisely because when you looked into the depth of that presidency, almost 30 years, the changes that went on in that, and yet the constant source of belief and fundamental values of this place were throughout. So I asked Mary Frances, so we got to put together a book, we'd like to go to great speeches, what should we do? She said, Norman Thomas. I said, you know, Mary Frances, he was the socialist candidate for president. And she said, right, you probably don't want to publish that one, but let me tell you about Norman Thomas. So for the next hour and a half, I heard about how all the presidents came, they gave great addresses, but Norman Thomas sat in the back of the house with the young people and talked for most of the afternoon into the night, and then it turns out he could tell ghost stories. She was deeply devoted to Norman Thomas, as she was to so many of you, to this place, and to ideals. When I met her, her voice, as you may know, had a certain musical quality to it. She sounded a little bit like Aunt Bee in the Mayberry show, vocally. And yet she had Eleanor Roosevelt's sense of activism. This was not an ambivalent woman when she looked at the world. She had very strong points of view about things and stated them with really without much hesitation. And she also had a sense of, I think, fundamental judgment about how the world should work and in the disciplines that underlie the ability to make critical decisions. She reminds me so much, when I met Sandra Day O'Connor, oddly enough, she reminded me very much of Mary Frances Graham, except that the stories weren't nearly as much fun. But that kind of razor-sharp mind was very much evident. her gifts to Jane and I are multiple. The two small stories to finish. One, when talking about the house, she wanted to know how it was going for our kids, who were very small at the time. And I told her, well, you know, the parade of bats that come through at all stories of the house is sort of something to get used to for little kids, and it didn't happen right away. And she said, well, let me tell you the story. So she, as you may know, is the first person ever to be married here at the Hall of Philosophy. I noted that the board had to agree to have it done. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? So at any rate, so they were getting ready to be, and along comes, you know, the day, and she's sleeping in the third floor of the house in the attic area, and her mother came up to, and obviously she wasn't nervous because she was just sleeping right through, so her mother comes up to waken her. And, Mary Frances, you must get up, here we go. Mary Frances wakes up, sits up, and looks, and there hangs her wedding dress, which you can see, frankly, is quite lovely in this photograph down here. And on the veil of the wedding dress is a bat. And Mary Frances reacts, as any of us maybe would, except maybe Caroline Bissell, with less than delight at that. And her mother reaches over and grabs the bat, throws it out the window and said, oh, for goodness sake, Mary Frances, it's your wedding day. Get up, let's get going. Jane and I still shake our heads about the barehanded grab of the bat. What does that say about how you're raised? The other small story is to tell you is at the back end of all of this. When the board had the temerity to elect me as president, one of the first things I did after the end of that season was to go to Boston, and Ambassador and Mary Frances and I had a brief gathering. And she brought to me something that I will treasure for my entire life, and I'm deeply honored to have, and that is this leather-bound calligraphy representation of the memorial statement to the family by the Board of Trustees of this institution. It's a memorial tribute to Arthur Eugene Bester. And it is stylishly stated in the words of its time, and it goes back and quotes Harry Emerson Fosdick talking about her father at Riverside Church in New York for the memorial service. And this had been created simply for the members, excuse me, of the family. And she wanted me to have it. I still want to weep when I think about the generosity of that gift, and also it weighs heavily in my hand in terms of the kinds of responsibilities I think she was trying to convey to me. So as I thought about what to say at the end of all of this, I noted that when Albert Stessel died so many years ago, one of the last memorial statements that Arthur Bester made before he then, in fairly near term, died, was at the service for his friend Albert Stessel, when he quoted Grace Noel Cromwell. Maybe some of you know this piece called The Unbroken Rhythm, but in my mind it's what I like to say to Mary Frances. Perhaps we shall find at last that life and death are part of the same poem, rhyme on rhyme, with but a natural pausing for the breath as the sentence ends. That swinging out from time into eternity will make no break at all. That still, the perfect rhythm will be there, that the singing, high, sustained notes will not fail, nor the music falter on the waiting air. To mar the progress of that perfect thing, the epic we call life is strangely sweet, and yet, God grant upon its upward swing, it may take on beneath an abler hand a meaning that the heart can understand.
Not long ago, I was faced with a dilemma. In early June, my sister Louise and my brother Bester and myself and our respective families had gathered in a little cozy little farmhouse in the Berkshires to get together for the first time since my mom had passed peacefully 5 weeks before that. Our purpose was to mourn together and to remember together and to celebrate my mom's life and to laugh. And our purpose was also to plan this memorial service, this wonderful tribute to my mom, Mary Frances Graham. And this is where the dilemma sort of factored in, because I knew that I wanted to speak at this service. And I knew I wanted to tell you about my mom, but what could I really tell you that maybe you don't already know? That she was the embodiment of what Chautauqua is, and if you're here today, you already know that, of course. That she was a teacher, a world traveler, a sculptor, an activist who had marched with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama. None of those things would really tell you who my mom truly was. Then I thought I got it. And thank you, Tom, for allowing the truth to be stretched. Maybe I can tell you a funny story from the annals of the Graham travels. And that would be the thing I could do that would really tell you about my mom. So I said, I'll tell you about the time when we were on Aloha Airlines. We were going to be taking a flight from Honolulu to Maui. My mom and dad had gotten Bester and Louise safely seatbelted into their seats. They had checked their travel documents, everything was in order, looked into the overhead bins to make sure they had all their belongings, that everything was safe and secure. The plane prepared to leave, backed out of the good spot, started towards the runway, then came to an abrupt stop. The stewardess unbelted herself, came to my mom's seat. Stewardess was a word we could use back then, incidentally. And informed her that they had left their napping 10-year-old son in the departure bench. Well, they just laughed and laughed, and they still laugh. And it's funny, but it's not really what I wanted to tell you. Then while we were sitting in this farmhouse, out of the blue, my sister said, Louise said she had received this letter of condolence from a dear family friend of the Graham family, and she wanted to read it to us, and which she did. It was a heartfelt, eloquent, and I would like to read it to you myself, because it is what I want to tell you about my wonderful mom. How sad we were to hear about your mother, but how glad, too, to know her ending was so full of peace and love and quietness. Sometimes God does the right thing. And what a remarkable woman. Friend, mentor, wife, mother, actor. It seems to me your mother lived her isness right up to the end. I admired her, liked her so much. There are a few people I know who have better managed fierce intelligence with greater modesty, generosity, compassion. You could always count on your mother for the truth, a truth dressed as a friend, and a friend bearing the name Opportunity. That's amazing, and it's why she was such a leader of such ability and strength. Plus, she was fun. What a balancing act. Above all, your mother lived out her potential and then some. Her decision to donate her body to science was to me an encore. A typical Mary Frances act. Just a little ahead of the curve and just so generous. Please give our love to all of your family, as well as our admiration and joy at having had the experience of your mother in our lives. Yet she feels available still in our friendship today. Let's be sure to tend the honor. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Claudia Jeanette Bester, and Mary Frances was my great aunt, and truly she was a great aunt. My middle name comes from Jeanette Bester, who was the mother of Mary Frances, and of my grandfather Arthur and my great-uncle Charles, also known as the baby. I'm very honored to be here today and celebrate her life and be part of the last great gathering of family and friends she has organized around her. Bringing people together and fostering a sense of community and kinship was one of Mary Frances's many strengths. In my family, Mary Frances was always the one working behind the scenes to keep us united. She was the string around the bundle, so to speak. When my father was only 7 or 8, she was his guardian angel during very tough times in the midst of World War II, and he was always very grateful to have spent his vacations during high school and college with her and Andy and Bester, Chris, and Louise. She invited us all many times to stay with her here in Chautauqua, and it's thanks to her that I've gotten to know my wonderful cousins and extended family who are here today. But as we all know, Mary Frances was much more than the generous matriarch that she was. The expression role model is such a cliche that I really would like to avoid it, but it's so apt in this case that I have to use it. Mary Frances is certainly a role model to me and to many, many others. And when I try and break it down, there are at least 3 main qualities, in addition to her commitment to family and friends, that I really try and incorporate in my own life. First of all, she was very adventurous. Whether flying on joyrides with Amelia Earhart as a teenager, or whitewater rafting with Chris in her 80s, she was always game to try anything. She was a world traveler and has trekked, sailed, hitchhiked, skied, and flown all over the world. She was always extremely curious and learning new things, and was very courageous. And I'm pretty sure, except maybe aside from bats, that Mary Frances was not afraid of anything on earth. The second quality I admire was her activism for human rights and her lifelong participation in progressive politics. As mentioned, she joined Martin Luther King in his marches on Selma and on Washington, and was very active in the very progressive Riverside Church in New York. And was also an expert and an advocate for education with the PTA, the Boy and Girl Scouts, the League of Women Voters, and especially with the YMCA and Linfield College. And the third quality I admire was her perpetual optimism and positive energy. Every second I have ever spent with Mary Frances, she was always sunny, bubbling, laughing, and fun to be with. When presented with a problem, she would turn it into a challenge and roll up her sleeves and just get to work. She seemed to have all the energy in the world. Knowing Mary Frances and knowing she lived a very, very long and rich life, I've concluded that the secret to longevity can be found in her 4 greatest strengths. Keeping close with the ones you love, acting on your convictions, and always staying curious and optimistic. And I'm very happy to see all her best qualities continuing on in the people who are here today, but nonetheless, I will miss her very much. Thank you.
When I was a very young partner in our law firm, one of my more senior partners came to me one day and said, "Dick, I have to give you some advice." He said, if somebody whom you don't know socially or professionally very well asks you to lunch, you should be very, very careful. But if 2 people of that character ask you to lunch, you should never go. I think of Mary Frances as the woman who could only say yes. Pick up the phone. This is Mary Frances. Mary Frances, would you like to go to dinner? Yes. Who is this? She loved the adventure of meeting new people. She loved the challenge of what might be around the corner in terms of what they might introduce to her. And she was very, very adept at making friends and very adept at meeting challenge. Mary Frances had a very unusual quality in terms of being a trustee of this institution. And that is that she understood Chautauqua as a whole. She understood it in its entirety, not just in little individual parts. She knew how the pieces fit together. She knew what they each offered to each other, and she knew how indispensable each piece was. That was a very unusual characteristic, and still is an unusual characteristic in a trustee. Trustees generally come to the institution table thinking of themselves as stewards in a monetary sense, watching where the dollars go, watching where the big expenditures are, watching how things might be trimmed and cut back. Joan pulled together, just before the season, a conference of religious leaders from many, many different denominations and backgrounds and all around the country and probably the world. And one of the lead-off speakers said something that reminded me very much of Mary Frances, and I would like to read it to you. This is the Reverend C. Welton Gaddy, who has been at Chautauqua several times and I think is coming again this season. Chautauqua is one of the few places where personal community is on the agenda. It calls people to lofty dreaming and pragmatic action, to talk poetry and engage in politics, to listen to breaking news and read lasting literature. If you add to that all of the cultural aspects of this place, all of which Mary Frances enjoyed to the hilt, you would have a very, very good picture of how she saw this place. She came to the Board of Trustees in 1978. Bob Hess became president of the institution in 1977. Bob was on a mission to get a better degree of control of all of the artistic forms of Chautauqua, to bring them into a better framed budget, to get more rehearsal time for the orchestra, which was a huge contract negotiation problem, to bring out the best in the theater group. And this began to be a bit of tension around the community that had concerns about what we all have concerns about, called change. And Howard Gibbs, then chair, had the foresight to make Mary Frances the chairman of the program committee. She took on that responsibility in 1981, which happens to be the same year that the Board of Trustees fired the Cleveland Playhouse. And drama was gone from the grounds for the rest of 81 and for all of 82. But Mary Frances, in her determination, was convinced that we should always have drama at Chautauqua. And she began with the program committee to explore various ways in which that could happen. And there were numerous iterations of attempts and trials and basic ways to try to come at that problem, all of which ultimately laid the seeds for what we have now. She was convinced that Chautauqua should be the presenter, should be in control of its artistic forms, should have the ability to mount all of the cultural aspects that were so important to this institution by its own company. The symphony was under equal stress at that time. There was lots of tension around the grounds. There was lots of talk about, well, we don't need this orchestra. We could do with a youth orchestra. We could bring in the Pittsburgh Orchestra for the summer. It was a very, very tense period, and Mary Frances managed to steer her way through that very, very well. The opera, as all of you who have been trustees, and there are several of you here know, has always endured the very difficult problem of always having been a line item in the budget. The only cultural form that stood out as a specific line item, and consequently, the basic target for the trustees. She would have none of that. She insisted that this is all part of the whole. We are going to have to subsidize some things for the good of the whole organization. And the consequence of all that was that the opera survived, the symphony survived, the theater survived, each of them now in a much more vibrant and different form for opera, but still very, very vibrant and very, very important to the cultural life of the institution. Following her trusteeship, she went on to the Board of Trustees, or Board of Directors of the Foundation. And Tom, as he has already told you, appeared on the scene in 1985. And Mary Frances was on the board from 1987 to 1983. And one of Tom's first acts was to go to Winston-Salem and seduce Mary Frances into once again saying yes to being the chair of the Overture to the Future campaign, which was primarily focused on endowment for the performing arts. Mary Frances said, yes, of course. And that went very, very well. She raised $5.5 million, virtually all of it for the arts. And I think that was a very good example of playing out all of her interests in the performing arts and her dedication to protecting them, to enable them to survive, and to nurturing them into the future. Many of you here have had leadership roles in the institution. Others of you may still have leadership roles in the institution. But I've often wondered what it is that brings people like you and others of us to the leadership table. And I think a large part of that is memories. We remember, and we admire, and we are grateful. Mary Frances, your memory will be that continuing stimulus on these grounds for as long as there is Chautauqua. Thank you.
Mary Frances was my aunt, my feminist aunt, and an aunt I miss. She was, you know, one of those traditional aunts of the 40s and 50s who lives 1,000 miles away and sent a present for the family at Christmas time. An aunt you would occasionally hear about or visit. This all changed in 1959 when I came to New York State to college. This began what would become a special and lifelong relationship, one deeply loving and caring. Mary Frances would be my role model for the next 53 years. All through my college years, I would be a frequent weekend guest of Mary Frances and Amby at their home in Bronxville or Hunts End. On these occasions, Mary Frances introduced me to the 60s way of cooking. You know, just open 2 or 3 different cans and varieties of Campbell's soup, mix them together, add a protein and then a rice, potato, or noodle, cook for 35 minutes in a 350-degree oven, and voila. What a casserole. Although Mary Frances forgave me for not going to Vassar, she did understand I needed a strong science background. She did not totally let me off the hook. She plied me with novels or texts written by Vassar graduates or professors. But why? Was it perhaps because she understood the need for my scientific education to be tempered by Vassar's literary and humanistic sensibilities? It was during these years that Mary Frances and I began our dialogue and vigorous discussions about the lives and roles of women. Could our lives include more than being a wife and a mother? We both knew the answer, yes. But the real question was, how? This was where our real discussions focused. Opinions differed. Invariably, Mary Frances's wisdom would be recognized and would prevail. This question and discussion repeated itself throughout the next 53 years, many, many more times. The women's movement of the 70s had not begun. There was no Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, or Bella Upset. But there was Mary Frances, already out there, walking her walk long before Gloria, Betty, and Bella. It was Mary Frances who gave me the courage to break out of the society mold of what a woman should be. It was done in a way my own mother could not have done. Yes, I could go to summer school and not become a junior league member. And yes, I could live and work to my potential, even after marriage. Mary Frances was the gentle, firm, focused feminist who did not need to be angry or strident to achieve her vision or objective. She was living and working to her potential, regardless of societal norms and expectations of the day. I I am drawn to the similarities between Mary Frances' life and values and those of the author, Jack Kerouac. Through their books, his, On the Road, and hers, My Open Road, we discover lives lived, lost in a passionate quest for meaning and belonging. They each sought deeper meaning at a period of time when conflict and cynicism dwelled abroad in our land. Similarly, Mary Frances found an antecedent in J.D. Salinger's anti-hero Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, who, like Mary Frances, rejected phoniness and conformity and embraced adventure. She chose a life that would transcend the conventional to pursue a career in leadership with the YWCA, a life that would promote a more human society, determined as she was to promote racial harmony and social progress for women. Mary Frances stood shoulder to shoulder with the marches in Selma and was front and center as history was being made on the National Mall when the Reverend Martin Luther King famously proclaimed, "I have a dream," on August 28, 1963. I'm sure you can appreciate the emotional support she provided me when I developed a large midwifery practice in the Bronx for medically indigent women. Neither of us feared for my safety. Mary Frances knew my respect and care for those I served was all that I needed, and she taught me to totally believe that. During a time of national suspicion and warmongering, Mary Frances believed in and worked toward better U.S. and Russian people-to-people relationships. She felt that understanding our similarities would allow people to enjoy friendship, cooperation, and mutual good. For Mary Frances to have such a view was not without risk. Some might say Mary Frances had confidence. I would say she had a sense of adventure, a desire to be open to the unknown. Mary Frances knew in her heart that it was far better to do something, however flawed or incomplete, than to simply stand by and do nothing. Mary Frances was indeed happy because she knew happiness was not a goal, but indeed life's raison d'etre. As a feminist, she would not be held back by narrow conformist rules, but instead literally wrapped her arms around all of humanity, regardless of color or ethnicity. Mary Frances' focus on similarities versus differences was her raison d'etre. It gave her purpose, and it gave her happiness. What a role model. She certainly gave me a friendship and a relationship built on mutual respect for each other and a fervent commitment to the cause of feminism.
I do feel actually that any gathering that has Mary Frances as a reason for us to gather, there should be some applause. And Jared and Sarah Ashcroft and Charles, my uncle who composed the music, absolutely stunning. Get the applause going. There are three reasons why I need to take pictures here. I mean, first is this is a great view, and Mary Frances would love this view. Secondly, as a documentarian, if I don't have pictures, it never happened. Third, also, I need to take photos home because my wife is unable to be here. She's caring for our ill grandchild, and she would very much want to be here, but she is providing a great grandmother service so that our daughter Lacey, who has a great affection for Mary Frances, could be here. And so I want to make sure there are pictures to share with Penny and Julian. But Lacey is like also her brother Slater, Casey, Hunter, Jan, Chris Jr., so many of the young people in our family that are a part of Mary Frances's legacy and have just a very important and very deep feeling for Mary Frances. There is quite an extended family here today. Mary Frances has always embraced all of us as members of her family. She often would speak so generously, with an admiration and deep affection for Dick and Miriam, Joan and Tom, Jane, Cynthia and Eagle, for Jeffrey. Folks who are all helping to create the memory of Mary Frances be alive and vibrant and joyful for us today. Certainly for Mary Frances, Chautauqua was a home. It was her place of birth, and for 94 consecutive years, she participated in the life and spirit of this community. Now, she wanted to be the person at Old First Night, standing longer than anyone else. Well, her last summer here, she and Flossie Norton and I were in the amphitheater, and along came the announcement, 90 years, and then 91, 92, 93, 94, and she looked around and smiled. And then 95 was called out, and Mary Frances had to sit down. We looked and saw someone way back in the, at the end of the amphitheater, still standing, and Mary Frances turned to me and said, "I don't believe her. She must be deaf. Where's her cane?" Mary Frances did spend much time here at Chautauqua, but she also was a world-class traveler, visiting almost every continent many times over. She spent her entire 7th grade year traveling with her brother, Arthur, and her father and mother around the world. It was an upfront glimpse at the insights, at what her father, then the president of Chautauqua, how he was gaining insights about what was shaping international politics. She was able to see his commitment to making Chautauqua a world stage in which global concerns were part of the daily dialogue. That is something certainly that continues today. It filled her with an unquenchable curiosity and interest in being involved in issues that made a difference. Her father, Arthur Bester, would call the experience here at Chautauqua the productive use of the margins of time, a place where education never stops. And that certainly was the life that Mary Frances led. A life filled with choices made consciously, lived thoughtfully. Often that meant taking time to be prepared for a variety of endeavors she encountered, prepared to be an activist and speak her mind, as Pixie so well eloquently gave us an insight into. There are many stories to share regarding Mary Frances's encounters with presidents, and I think some of us know her concerns for the well-being of the Roosevelts when they visited here in '36. But less well known was her time at the Johnson White House. Lady Bird had invited her and a coterie of national women leaders who were feminists and civil rights activists to honor their contributions as the president changed history through legislation. Following that luncheon, the president stopped by to mingle and be admired, And as he was leaving, Mary Frances made her way to the doorway where he was heading. And as she told the story, LBJ was a big man. But I stood my ground. I was wearing one of those big hats with a wide brim, and I blocked his exit. It gave me a time to make sure that he had a chance to hear my mind. And then there was the issue of making sure her vote counted. Now, when I was a youngster, my father took me to an Eisenhower for President rally at Madison Square Gardens. And upon returning home, I shared with my mother how my dad and I had heard someone yell from the balcony, "Give him hell, Ike!" My mother looked over at my father with a stern glare. Now, I always thought she was concerned that I was being exposed to a rude, rough side of life. But then I learned that my parents would drive miles and miles each election day to ensure that they voted. Why? Because they were on opposite sides of the political aisle and neither wanted to allow the other to cast a vote that would count if they couldn't cancel each other out. As for the Ike rally, well, the truth was that she was disappointed at my father's tactics to lure me into the Republican camp. But she didn't need to fear. I am my mother's son when it comes to politics. The life lived well was expressed artistically in sculpture, painting, poetry, all talents cultivated here at Chautauqua during her margins of time. And certainly the most prolific expression, besides her capacity for good chat, conversation, and gossip shared with many of us here, was her dedication to the writer's craft. It is evident in the book she wrote about her father called The Chautauqua Salute, which chronicles her life as his daughter and his influence upon this institution. But for her children, the scribed commitment came to us every Christmas as a new essay or memoir. We would be delighted by big folders received in the mail with journals recounting family trips we had made, such as a 5-week automobile trip from New York City to Fairbanks, Alaska, and back by way of Las Vegas. She wrote about her trip abroad as a young woman, leading a group of young women students to Europe in the summer of 1939, and her dash home from Germany. It was called An Innocent Abroad, but for her it was a time that made her wise. Her most astounding piece, though, came as a 100-page epistle entitled For the Duration, telling of the 4.5 years she and my father Ambrose were apart during the war. It revealed the trials of communicating when it took 6 weeks for letters to be received and how easy it was to misjudge the immediacy of emotion. It informed us, the reader, of life at home where socks were knitted for the Red Cross, sojourns were made to the popular plays on Broadway, and love and care provided for her young infant Bambi, who would not live much past the age of 2. It captures the time, and it captures the love she and Ambi shared during this separation, which was not long after they were married here in the Hall of Philosophy. Now, of course, they weren't separated for the entire 4.5 years, as I was born just as the war ended. Her writings are filled in boxes at home. They include book reviews, speeches to the YWCA, skits for and about friends, and scribbles sharing poetic affection and sorrow. They are filled with her knowledge and always contain deep affection for what she was writing about. In her vivid descriptions, you are reminded by one of her most abiding traits, her love for her family. She always cared about so many things that she felt mattered, and most of all, it was her family that really mattered. Her family, of course, includes Chautauqua and many friends she has here today. 42 years ago, she stood across the way at the Hall of Christ and spoke about her own mother who had passed. What she said then is so much what I would say now about Mary Frances, my mother. So I quote her. Caring and concern were shining threads that ran through the whole fabric of her life. Nowadays, you hear people say of something, I couldn't care less. She could never have said that. She was fiercely partisan at times, outspokenly critical, but you always knew it was because she could care more, and she did. So Mary Frances, I know that you know how much we have cared about you.
Last year, when we lost Mary Frances' good friend, my mother, I became passionate about trying to identify what it was that made my mother uniquely who she was and distinct from anyone else. There were lots of things that were true about her that were true about many people. But what was true only about her? Likewise, I asked myself, what could I say about Mary Frances that was uniquely true about her? When I was talking with Louise after Mary Frances died, she told me a story about how she and some other family members and Mary Frances were sitting around talking about how they felt as if they were on the outside in certain situations and what they did to try to cope with it. Mary Frances said that she didn't think she ever had that experience of feeling as if she didn't belong. I found that amazing, but also consistent with who she was. She seemed to be unusually at home with herself and in the world. She had a kind of comfort with herself that if she'd had to work at it, might have made her arrogant. She was self-assured, but there wasn't any arrogance. She didn't hold herself back, and she didn't push herself forward. She was just very present and available to be interested. She usually seemed to be having the most wonderful time. I have a picture of her with my mother, which actually is this picture right here. And my mother's hand is visible. That shows how she kind of glowed sometimes. Our two families go a couple of generations back. During the time when her father, Arthur Bester, was the institution's president, my great-uncle Ralph Norton was a trustee. When her father died, Ralph became president and donated the Bester Plaza fountain in honor of Arthur Bester. My parents were here at her wedding and here in the Hall of Philosophy. The relationship between my immediate family and hers always seemed like family and still does. Her children and I have known each other since we were little ones. We both had slightly wacky fathers too, which I think helped make us all comfortable. Helped make us all comfortable with both our families' offbeat undertakings. My mother and Mary Frances were really good friends and tremendously enjoyed each other's company. My clearest memories of Mary Frances come from somewhat recent years when she used to come here in the summer and stay with my mother. The two of them had the best time together. It was the treat of the day for me to sit at breakfast with them and hear their perspectives about everything going on here and in the world at large. Mary Frances told us about how, when she was a child, her parents took her and her brother out of school and took them on an extended trip to Europe, the one you were talking about. The requirement for them was to write every day about their experience. I got to read a manuscript of a book she was writing about it at age 90-something. I suppose that childhood experience laid the groundwork for her to be such a great observer and storyteller and writer. I treasure what I learned from her. I treasure the gift of her and her family's friendship. And I treasure my recollection of her glowing spirit.
Mary Frances, among other things, and some of the things I'm going to say are going to mirror what other people have said, because Mary Frances was a many-faceted mirror who showed us all ourselves in the best light. But in any case, Mary Frances and I were really pals. We were good friends. And I spent several summers with her and Flossie, Cynthia's mother, after I had sold my cottage. And it was a privilege to spend time with the two of them. A few years earlier, Mary Frances and I would go to the University Beach and go swimming. Mary Frances had learned to be a good swimmer as a child in La Jolla in the Pacific Ocean. I had not, in Pittsburgh, learned to be a good swimmer. So I would be flopping around kind of ineptly in the water, and Mary Frances, 35 years older, would be doing her laps back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. In the Chautauqua Salute, the memoir of the Bester years that Mary Frances wrote about her family and her father's time as president of Chautauqua, the first page is a page of acknowledgments. And when I pulled the book out a few days ago, putting these remarks together, I was shocked to read at the end of the first page her saying, "One of the first to show an interest in my project and to give constant encouragement has been Jeffrey Simpson, lifelong Chautauqua resident and friend." I was very, very touched, but I don't remember giving her any encouragement. I didn't need to give her any encouragement. I found it fascinating. I found everything she said fascinating. I think I simply was there. One of the clues, I think, to Mary Frances's fascination for everyone and her fascination with the world was that she lived absolutely in the present moment. She had such an experience of history and such a sense of history and could convey it, but she lived in the moment. She just was more present than anybody I have ever known. That memoir was published by the institution, I think, in 1990. And later she wrote a memoir that Bester referred to about her young married life when Ambrose was in World War II. And it is equally fascinating and very, very moving and candid and very personal. She talks about her mother being doubtful whether Mary Frances and Ambrose should have more children after their disabled son died. But the second memoir was indeed personal, but because of Mary Frances's disciplined mind, she spent time in the library and put her personal life in the context of national and world events. She would talk about living in New York with her parents while her husband was overseas, and then talk about Pearl Harbor and rationing, and it made the memoir a document, a very moving personal document, but an historical document. And that was characteristic of Mary Frances. She had, in addition to her omnivorous and obvious curiosity, a very disciplined and educated mind. Certainly Vassar played a big part in that, but her birth and early years at Chautauqua obviously were the real source of that. She had done the things that everyone has referred to, was the Dean of Women at Linfield College, was very active in the administration of the YWCA, but it was really Chautauqua that formed her personality, her intellect and her personality, and her public personality. I've always thought this was fascinating about Mary Frances. She says in the memoir of the Bester years, "We lived in a fishbowl," and while her father was president, which went on until she was 34, and she had a uniquely public personality. I think, and I'm really not joking about this, I think it is not too much of a stretch to compare her to Queen Elizabeth, who has warmth and connects with people on a personal level. At least everyone thinks that she's connected with them on a personal level, but who also has had a private life that she had to balance with that her whole life. And Mary Frances, the account of her wedding in the Hall of Philosophy is fascinating because Mr. Rashid, who owned Rashid's Oriental Bazaar before it was Halaby's Oriental Bazaar, I remembered that he had covered the whole brick walk with Oriental rugs. It turns out when I looked at it, he covered the podium with Oriental rugs. But anyway, Mary Frances had that effect on people. And because she grew up in this with this public persona, and her family having a public persona, she did not cultivate a public personality. She imbibed it and gave it back. And as her father legendarily did, she attended to everyone with warmth and charm and sincerity, and making each person feel uniquely singled out, which I have read Queen Elizabeth has that effect too. But she had to have a private life. And the private life was sometimes difficult in several ways. Public people have to live up to the world's expectations every minute. I mean, they can never spit out a piece of gum or do anything that is possibly going to diminish their image. And they have to give tirelessly. And often there is not as much coming in as they are expected to give out. And this can be in spiritual terms, and it also can be in a very real way in financial and material terms. And Dr. Bester, balancing the depression and the receivership of the institution and all of those enormous pressures, they did not have an easy time personally and financially. And yet they were seen as icons who were the source of everyone else's well-being. And I've always thought that must have been a very difficult thing to do, and Mary Frances did it really brilliantly. Of course, part of a manifestation of this was her incorrigible gregariousness, who I guess Dick said, you know, that she would say yes no matter what. Mary Frances was always the first person at a party. If you gave a party and invited Mary Frances, she was there on the dot. Not embarrassingly early, but never fashionable, even 5 minutes late. She was the first person there. And our friend June, and that was enthusiasm, but also a sense of responsibility to the host. And our friend June Osborne said that if you had Mary Frances, you didn't need anybody else. Mary Frances was the party. I first met her on the program committee, and the things that Dick Miller so articulately ran over about her saving theater at Chautauqua and being determined that there would be theater. She lived on a stage herself, and she knew the communication factor that went on between artists and among people who were watching a performance and what went on with the performance. I just have two, well, maybe three little short anecdotes at the end. In 1986, I was invited to go with Chautauqua to the Soviet Union, which was just one of the great events of my life. And Mary Frances and Flossie Norton were on the trip, and the three of us were inseparable through the entire trip. Absolutely inseparable. And Mary Frances, with her characteristic curiosity and intellectual activity, had made flashcards for herself of the Cyrillic alphabet. And she had an English-Russian dictionary because she was going to read the signs and find out where we were as we were being taken around in these buses. Well, it didn't work very well, actually. But toward the end, we were on a bus and we passed a big sign. And I said, Mary Frances, what does that say? And she said, Pepsi. And I had seen the logo, so I knew that that was going to be what it said. One of the few, in fact only, I think, argument or anything verging on an argument that we ever had. One morning we were at breakfast in a hotel, I think in Moscow, and Intourist they were attentive to an exhausting degree. And every morning at breakfast, they would lecture over the public address system on what you were going to see that day and what you were going to do that day and so on. And I said, this is so boring, I just don't want to hear this anymore, really, every single morning. And Mary Frances said, well, maybe Jeff is such a bright boy, he doesn't need to pay attention to all of this, but I want to know these things. So I was correctly put in my place. A favorite final memory of Mary Frances is, Tom referred to her voice. And her voice, I mean, that wonderful, cultivated, slightly fluting voice and her personality, when I would see Julia Child on television, it always reminded me of Mary Frances. Now, her daughter-in-law reminded me that she couldn't really cook, but nonetheless, the educated, concerned, engaged woman of that time, they really reminded me of each other. So, Mary Frances went to her 70th Vassar reunion, and she came back. And I said, well, how was it, Mary Frances? And she said, there were 9 of us there, and 8 of us were in our right minds. And I think those 8 were in their right minds because Mary Frances kept them in their right minds. And I think she did that for all of us and for Chautauqua. And I will miss her.
Hi, I'm Louise. Mary Frances was my mother. And I am going to give you a few daughterly thoughts, but before I do, I first want to say how grateful I am to see all of you here. And I know you're here because of your friendship with my mother, but I feel it coming towards all of us, and just thank you. It's such a privilege to have that, and know that that wonderful network of friends continues and is extended to all of us. So thank you. The other thing I want to say, a little detour, is that I have one thing in common with the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and that's that we both cry in public. So I have, it's already been used, but anyway, I got it ready. So I've been moved to tears and laughter this afternoon, realizing how many of our remembrances of my mother concern her skills as a storyteller. And although neuroscience tells us that we are all storytellers, my mother was an especially good storyteller. It was perhaps the essential characteristic that made her not only fun to be with, but ensured that she continued to have attentive audiences. Recounting events and deeds became her currency, not just for social interaction, but also for gentle education. She helped her listeners to better understand human behavior and showed them how lofty ideals can be applied in everyday life. So how did she become such a fluent storyteller? Well, not surprisingly, Chautauqua was her storytelling nursery. Quite literally, from her cradle onward, she was surrounded by an environment of intellectual stimulation. By her account, throughout her childhood, her family routinely sat around the kitchen or dining room table and nonstop discussed and deliberated and debated the issues of the day. My mother recalled that conversations never really ended. They were only just suspended until family members returned from attending a lecture or a concert or a social function. It was common for a topic to be talked about from dawn till dusk, and then resumed again the following day. Mom also reported that my grandfather, Arthur E. Bester, liked his family to think out loud, and apparently the louder, the better. The joke in the family was that they were all masters at using amphitheater voices. So what happens when the storyteller can no longer summon the words to tell the story? When the neural mechanisms propelling verbal communication are damaged? This was the terrible reality my mother confronted when she suffered a stroke in the summer of 2004, which crippled the left hemisphere of her brain. As a consequence, she endured global aphasia, blindness, and confinement to a wheelchair. The prognosis for stroke victims is often bleak, and the chance for recovery often limited. And this was so for my mother. Her ability to express her perceptions, memories, and actions was compromised, and it seemed that the storyteller in her had been silenced. The challenge for my mother, and for me, because I became her primary caretaker, was in discovering how to make her life going forward continue to be meaningful and satisfying. We knew that the old ways weren't going to work, and that we had to find new ones that would maintain her engagement with the world around her. My new role as caretaker and my mother's new role as dependent required a complete overhaul of our relationship. At times, I felt I had lost my mother and our old comfortable patterns of living. I missed my wise guide, who always had a ready suggestion or provided me with food for thought. It took me some time to come to terms with being the decision maker, and I didn't always like the struggle that this required. But as my mother accepted with grace and humility that I was now in charge of her life, I recognized that her love for me was still as strong and as powerful as ever, and that it never ceased to be a mother's love. As we grew, I think the profound lesson that we both learned is that a meaningful existence is about the interactions we have with one another and our world. These interactions allow us to connect in many ways and on many levels. In other words, a meaningful existence is not the sole property of our brains. This means that a disability does not make any less possible our capacity to interact and make connections and enjoy a life worth living. So together, Mom and I embarked on a new adventure and used the effects of her stroke to imagine and create new forms of connection. It seemed that Mom experienced a new awareness, which apparently is reported by many stroke victims. It seems that she felt a childlike innocence and curiosity about her world. She related to me a sense of being fully in the here and now, and seemed able to appreciate the richness of the moment. Her past no longer intruded upon her present, and she was free of judgment, preconceived ideas, and unburdened by regrets. In a way, her world was refreshed. This helped us turn the process of finding alternative modes of communication into a game. I became adept at interpreting her pantomimes and deciphering the hidden meanings of the words she used. Puzzling out her unusual phrasing was actually a fun detective job. Lots of laughter and playfulness entered our daily interactions, and storytelling developed into a cooperative event. Proper names were especially problematic. Mom knew who family members were, but she could not say their names or apply a correct label for a relationship. For example, she might introduce me as her father or brother, but never as her daughter or Louise. She referred to my husband as the man upstairs, and a sister-in-law as the secretary. Many people were simply called dog. Well, what was that about? Okay, let me explain. I am a canine behavior consultant, which means that I work professionally with dogs. I often involved my mother in my dog training programs. Now, you may be familiar with therapy dogs who provide wonderful care for people needing comfort. When a furry therapist places their head in a person's lap, both human and canine feel good and happy all over. And this is really great stuff. But things went a little differently with my mother. I have a 100-pound German Shepherd trained to track people. This skill is developed by utilizing the dog's natural predilection to engage in predatory behavior. It's the sheer thrill of chasing down prey that motivates a tracking dog, not bringing comfort or solace. In any case, I recruited Mom to play lost victim in games of search and rescue. Sometimes I'd stash her behind the back of the building, or in her wheelchair I'd tuck her between parked cars. On other occasions, I'd simply hide her in the woods among some trees. Then off we'd go. I'd let my dog out to go find her, and I'm happy to report we had a very high success rate. Mom and dog took their work seriously, and of course were generously rewarded, the dog with hunks of raw meat, Mom with ice cream and a hug. So if my mother referred to you as a dog, this was a good thing. It meant you had exhibited considerable professionalism and were held in high esteem. Now to return to my storyteller. If you're going to be a good storyteller, it helps to have better than average recall. Several decades ago, long before Mom's stroke, my husband and I escorted her on an early spring auto tour of the British Isles. All we had to do was hit a bump in the road, and Mom would start reciting poems by whatever poet was indigenous to our locale. In the Lakes District, it was lines from Wordsworth that floated in the air. Okay, fast forward. Days before my mother's death, during a family visit, we were having fun demonstrating to her the wonders of our newest technology gadget, an iPhone. Remembering Mom's enjoyment of Wordsworth's poem, Daffodils, we asked Siri, my newest best friend, to find it for us. As we read the lines out loud, Mom smiled happily and recited with us the poem she still knew by heart. I'd like to conclude with that poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretch in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bless of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with daffodils. Thank you.
The family would want you to know before the closing words that you're all invited to a lovely reception right across the way at the Hall of Missions so that we can greet one another and share our own stories and our own memories. Bester and I talked a little bit about how would we close this. And I said to Bester, your mother was not terribly religious. And I remember talking to both of them, to Florence and to your mother. And they would always tell me with some apology, we know you're the director of religion, and we're not terribly religious. But they would also, both of them in their own way, say, but we don't want you to think that we're not spiritual. People of the Spirit. And so it is in that sense that I think one way to close this is what perhaps would be thought of as both a spiritual and a religious clothing. The voice of one who loved us is always with us. Memories become the way people live on, beyond the years in which can touch them, or see them, or hear their voice. And as I have come to see from my own mother, that her voice, though it may in fact not be more than a whisper once she is gone, there is power in that voice that in some way lasts throughout the years, throughout the ages, and beyond the generations. So if we were in a religious service, we might say words that I think are very, very fitting for the end of this. Into your hands we commend your servant, Mary Frances. Acknowledge, we humbly pray, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, and a daughter of your own redeeming. Receive her into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the company, now and forever, of the saints in light. Amen.
Amen.